We'll go ahead and start recording. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to WEC's Reliability in the West discussion series. Excited to have you here for a discussion about IBRs and registration. It's currently 11 a.m. Mountain Time. Today is April 3rd. I'm Travis English, WEC's Senior Training and Outreach Specialist. Appreciate you joining us. We're going to start off with the antitrust policy. All WEC meetings are conducted in accordance with the WEC antitrust policy and the NERC antitrust compliance guidelines. All participants must comply with the policy and guidelines. This meeting is public. Confidential or proprietary information should not be discussed in the open session. This webinar is also being recorded and it will be posted publicly. By participating, you give your consent for your name, voice, image, and likeness to be included in that recording. WEC strives to ensure the information presented today is accurate and reflects the views of WEC. However, all interpretations and positions are subject to change. If you have any questions, please contact our legal counsel. I'm going to take a quick look at today's panelists that are going to be joining us for the IBR discussion about registration. We are lucky to have Howard Google, Vice President of Compliance Assurance and Registration at NERC with us. John Pispisa, he is Director of Operational Compliance at Southern California Edison, and Mark Rogers, he's a Senior Technical Advisor with Registration and Certification here at WEC. So I appreciate the three of you joining us for the panel. And with that, I'd like to bring in our moderator, Chris Raper. She's the Vice President of Strategic Engagement and External Affairs. Chris, I'll turn it over to you for the discussion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Travis, for the intro of me and our panelists. I'm looking forward to the conversation today. So just to lead in a little bit, for the last couple of months in February and March, we have had conversations about inverter-based resources and their impact on the grid and grid forming versus grid following, the benefits and or deficits of each approach. And an important part of why we're having this discussion isn't just because there's a lot of IBRs coming on the grid, but because NERC has proposed an increased or additional registration requirement in order to capture, for the benefit of reliability, some more of those IBRs that are larger generators. And to explain that better and more succinctly, I'm going to hand it over to Howard Google, who has been heavily involved in this development at the NERC level. Go ahead, Howard, please.
Thanks, Chris, and welcome everyone. I'm glad we're having this conversation today, and I'm looking forward to future conversations that we'll have throughout today and then ongoing. I'd like to provide a little bit of context, if I could, about why we're talking about inverter-based resources, and then I'll kind of get into the registration issues. The first event that kind of brought inverter-based resources to our attention was the Blue Cut Fire event that occurred back in August of 2016. That was the first, at least from NERC's perspective, the first event that we saw where there were major impacts on the transmission system due to inverter-based resources and their reactions and controls. One of the things that we noticed as we did our investigation, and that investigation, by the way, is posted on our website, was that not only were we seeing these inverters affecting the system at the transmission level or at the higher voltage level, but we also saw inverter-based resources that were connected at lower voltages also contributing or compounding some of the impacts. Did an investigation on that, had some recommendations that went out from it, actually had conversations with manufacturers about control systems, and were able to make some changes that I think compounded the system or actually improved the system well. In the meantime, over the last corresponding years up until 2023, we continue to see events that are on the system that are involving inverter-based resources. And so it's time to quit admiring the problem and actually take some action for reliability. And so we at NERC looked at the issues and looked to see, okay, what do we need to do? What's the issue for reliability, and how do we address that? And so one database that we looked at was information that is required by generators to be filed with the Department of Energy under the Energy Information Act. Using that database, it has information about where generation is located, what the size of it is, what type it is, whether it's, traditional, gas, coal, hydro, nuclear, or whether it's inverter-based resources, solar, wind, batteries. Those are all reported into there. We handed that over to our engineering team to say, okay, let's take a look at this database. Let's, look at past events that have occurred, and where do we think from a reliability standpoint is an appropriate place to draw a line for inverter-based resources that need to be subject to reliability standards at NERC. And so after some time doing the evaluation and looking at all of the events in there, it was really determined that, a 20 megawatt size, a plant size, if you will, and a voltage level greater than 60 kV was appropriate for that. As we looked at past events, again, as we looked at the amount of generation that would be covered by that cut, it put as a percentage the same amount of inverter-based resources that would be subject to standards that synchronous generator, the percentage of those two. And so we began working a couple of years ago on this project. Last year, we began working on our registration criteria. That's all developed as a very public process. We posted those potential changes to our registration criteria and received comments from industry on that. We presented a revised version of that went to our board in February at the open board meeting so that they could have some information on that. And then they chose to kind of absorb that and meet the following week to take action on it, at which time they approved the registration criteria and directed NERC staff to file that with FERC and applicable regulatory authorities going forward. So we did that. We filed that in March with FERC. That is a docket, by the way, that is open for comment. And in fact, the comments are due by April 18th. That docket number, if you're interested, is docket RR24-2-000. And again, FERC has posted that for comment and is saying that the comments are due by April 18th. We've asked FERC in our petition that they do that, and it was basically the same time frame too, and that they make a ruling on this registration criteria by June 19th. Let's talk a little bit about what this is and what it's not. This is talking about registration criteria. It's who needs to be registered to be subject to the standards. It's not what they must do at this point. So we're looking to see who owns these devices and operates these devices, and to have them registered if they meet the registration criteria. There will be separate projects in the standards space. That's, again, a very public process that will go into what they need to do and how that should apply to our existing standards body. And so once that registration criteria, assuming it's approved by FERC later this year, we will begin projects on the standard side to do modifications, both in our glossary of terms and then also in the standards themselves to determine what of these standards, or if any new standards need to be developed, that these generators should be applicable to. We also have committed to our board and to industry, and I'll make this commitment to you also, that communication we know is going to be a key, and we're going to communicate early and often. We sent out a communication, I don't know if you received it or not, but we sent out a communication earlier this week, basically providing an update on everything that we've done for inverter-based resources, and providing some links in that document to provide some additional context and more information, and then provide an FAQ document there too. We also, on our website, if you go to NERC.com and there's a banner bar at the very top, one of the drop downs says initiative. And if you drop down that initiative tab, there's a couple of things about inverter-based resources that are there. There's similar links to the email that we sent out earlier this week, but it specifically calls out what we're doing for the inverter-based resources registration project, and then all of the information that we've done throughout the organization on energy emergency or on alerts, on investigations that we've done, all that information. There's links to all of that on that particular page too. So again, you're going to see more communications about that going forward. We want to make sure that nobody's caught off guard, that everybody has the information that they need.
Thanks, Howard. I want to get into some of our other panelists. I appreciate you doing the intro on that. I think that at a high level, right, policymakers ought to be concerned that the actions being taken for the benefit of reliability across North America. And so I'm curious, John, I want to bring you into the conversation as a member on the panel from a regulated utility. This is unusual, right? And it's a different situation than what we often see with regard to both registration and standards. And so that's why, to Howard's point, the education point is really important to make sure that everybody's in the loop on what's going on. Nobody's concerned, right? Or at least we have an opportunity to address the concerns about why this new registration is being proposed, and the importance of an impact on reliability that this could have. So from a utility perspective, can you share with us a little bit about what this new registration threshold is going to, how it will impact you?
So thanks, Chris. And Howard, thank you for that really good introduction to the issue. One thing, Chris, that Howard, he touched on it briefly, but I want to make sure folks understand the resource that's out there that's available that's going to help people understand this issue even better. Is NERC has a really good resource. He mentioned one event, which was the Blue Cut Fire event. There have been multiple events, and I'm really happy with WEC's engagement here, because most of the events on their, I forget what you call the event tracker that you've got, but you've got an IBR, I think it's event tracker. It's a couple pages long. It's an easy read, and if you haven't read it, I would go read it. But most of the events have happened in the West. Most of the events have happened in California, and that's important. It's happening because California and the West are out in front on the integration of renewable resources to the grid. And the integration of renewable resources at all voltage levels. I mean, significant penetration of renewables at all voltage levels. And that's a success story, right? The greening of the grid, SCE's pathway to 2045, the commitment to green energy is entrenched in policy in the West, and it is the policy of the West. And so we need to ensure that as we move forward, and we're moving forward very quickly, that we keep an eye on reliability, and not just at the distribution levels, as there is state jurisdiction over, but also the interconnected bulk electric system that is one of the largest machines in the world. And actually, I think it is the largest machine in the world. And we need to ensure that there's consistent regulation across, both state and local boundaries to ensure that that grid remains reliable. So when we talk about what we've seen in California in particular, we've seen an inrush of renewable reliability facilities. So by that, I mean, we are shifting the role of providing reliability services from the traditional, fossil fuels based generation, providing renewable attributes. And we are moving that to green resources like batteries and other inverter based products, where they are providing those services. And as such, it makes sense to begin to see the need to provide that overarching, consistent regulatory approach to how we manage that, on the bulk electric system. And this isn't, I mean, I know we think this is new, but Howard and I talked a little bit about this. We've seen this collaboration between state and federal regulators in California before. So the California energy market, for example, I think is a shining star in the West around how that collaboration works. You have a state run independent system operator with a state appointed board, and you have federal oversight of how the markets work within that environment, and it works really well. And so I think a similar approach could also work well. It does require, though, participation by everyone, not just the regulators at the federal level, but also engagement by the regulators at the state level, and also all of the participants. And so when you ask about our role as an investor-owned utility that is regulated within the state of California, our role is the role that we traditionally play, right? So we collaborate with NERC. We ensure that we are, active participants in the development of the regulatory standards. But also, we have a unique role here too, because we play a role of providing the interconnection, providing the mechanism for these resources to connect to the grid. And as such, I think we have a role in ensuring that NERC is successful and our regulators are successful in this approach. So Howard talked about some of the data. There's difficulties in getting data and the data that's needed. I see the IOUs playing a role in ensuring that the data is there, but I also see the IOUs playing a role as kind of, and I'll use a loose term here, kind of the regulatory big brother to these resources that are new to this environment. So, I've been in this role since 2011 as, SCE's director of NERC compliance. We know the ins and outs of the process and how the mechanism works. We're going to have a bunch of new entrants. We're going to have to make sure that those new entrants, we coach them, we mentor them in how to be good citizens in the NERC compliance environment, how they do their registrations. But also, if you look at what NERC is proposing, I think we play a role in ensuring that participants or these facilities know when they need to register, because there's no one else that's in the position that we're in to understand the interconnection requirements coupled with the NERC requirements. I think that's our job. Will more than likely be our job as part of this, is to ensure that people know when they need to raise their hand and say, "Hey, I'm in scope. I need to register," and that they're committing to their role in ensuring reliability of the grid, into the future.
Thank you, John. I love the phrase regulatory big brother. I think that depending on the crowd that you say that in, that could be perceived in multiple ways, but
I hope it's perceived. I hope we're green framing this, right? And people understand that what I mean is we're as a coach and mentor, right? That's the way I look at it.
No, I love that. I think that is necessary. NERC doing the work to get a new regulatory threshold in place isn't the end of the story, right? It's the beginning of the story. Right. And so everything that you talked about, John, is what it's going to take to actually ensure reliability of the grid. And that is you all having the conversations with the smaller entities, because they don't know what they don't know. Right. But you know largely what they don't know. So I really appreciate that perspective and SCE's leadership in that role. And the one clarification I would provide is in talking about clean green energy for the West, not all states feel exactly the same about where that clean green energy threshold should hit. But the one thing that I think that they all can agree on is that decisions made in one state absolutely impact how other states are required to respond and react to those decisions made across their borders. And so the conversations are very important to continue to have, so that we can all make sure that reliability is the key point that everyone's driving towards, and making sure that we can all ensure. together.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember, Chris, that a disturbance in the bulk electric system is a disturbance on the bulk electric system. It is felt by everyone that is interconnected, regardless of where they're at.
That's right. I think that's a great point, that we are in fact all interconnected. So we're in it together. So Mark, I want to address you quickly also. What is this new registration threshold? What impact do you see from a WEC perspective, right? From the interconnection, the Western interconnection level, what's the impact going to be, do you believe, on the existing registered entities, the incoming registered entities, and the work that WEC is going to be required to do in order to help educate and all the things that John just listed need to occur with these new IBRs that will fall within a new threshold?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for attending. I appreciate the opportunity to share the floor or screen with Howard and John. I just want everybody to know that the registration team is working diligently to ask and talk to folks as much as possible to understand what their footprint looks like. What I mean by footprint is those new registered entities. Let me just give you an example of what we're looking at right now. We have 155 registered entities that have been identified who fall in the new criteria. We have 83 that's been identified as falling not registered currently with NERC and falling in the criteria. However, that 83, as we've been progressing, we feel like that's a very small number. We're looking at maybe 4 times that. So it's really a challenge at this point, but it's working with NERC in a collaborative manner on several committees, and WEC has formed their own team that involves every aspect and touches every part of the WEC footprint that we've brought in. That means folks who do studies, folks who are doing all the aspects that they do currently every day, but we're now all together in a collaboration and trying to learn and work with the other regions in NERC to understand what this looks like. So it's a progress that's moving very quickly, and we think that it's going to be a larger number. And you know what the folks have to understand is, well, is not only are these new entities that fall under the criteria that do not have an interaction with NERC, have not had an interaction. Besides those entities, we are on a glide plane of straight up for the ones who are registered and putting those BES or bulk electric system facilities in the ground right now. We have just had a conversation yesterday with a consultant that WEC interacts with on quite a bit. They have 380 in the queue. That is the pipeline that will go in the ground between now and 2027. That's just one consultant. So it's not only the new criteria, but it's a constant flow of new. As we said, the West is a place to put it in the ground.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. So I'm going to direct this at Howard, but I'd appreciate responses from any of you that have any knowledge or divine intervention on knowing how this might work out for us. And that is, do we envision a similar scenario to last time a threshold was created? And by that, I mean, it would seem that we have a phenomena that you create a threshold for whatever, for registration, for size of any kind of resource that comes online. And if you're monitored to some extent over that threshold, you watch a bunch of newly created generators come in just under that threshold so that they can avoid that oversight of whatever, right? You name it, across the board with regard to the electric system. Do we envision that might occur again with this new threshold establishment, that the new IBRs, the new generators that come on after this is put in place at whatever threshold is ultimately determined, that we'll have another tranche of new generators coming in just below to avoid that oversight?
Yeah, I wish I had divine insight, like you mentioned earlier, Chris. I don't, but I can assure you that as we go in and register folks, and as the standards are being developed and modified, that we will be continually monitoring. And if there are additional impacts to the system that are caused by new generation coming on that are trying to avoid the criteria, at that point, we'll do an engineering analysis to see whether or not thresholds need to be changed. At this point, we don't really envision that. But again, it's not outside the realm of feasibility. But we will be monitoring it, and we will continually be looking at reliability impacts for this generation or any other new technology that should be attached to the system.
Anyone else want to dive in on that? And also, Mark, I was hoping that you could answer John's question. He was talking about an event tracker, and I know that's much more your area of expertise within our organization than it is mine. If you could identify what that event tracker is, if anyone who's listening wanted to go and be able to see how it is that we track those.
I believe it's on our website. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact URL, but I could share it with you after this meeting, and if you wanted to share it out, I can do that, or to Travis, and he could share it out to everyone. But that's the tracker's important, but it's also some of the things we're looking at during registration. What different questions do we need to ask to help prevent that in the door? So what we're looking at with WEC is that the registration group is the front door now. So you're coming into WEC, and this is who you're going to interact with. And we really feel like that the most important questions are going to be asked up front. So I hope that helps.
The other thing I'd add to that, Chris, is, and I know WEC is tracking at least the events that are occurring on the WEC site. The initiative tab that I talked about on our website, which has kind of a one-stop shop, if you will, for inverter-based resources. We have links to all of the reports for all the events that we've investigated. That would be a good resource because it looks at not just events that have occurred in the West, but also others. We have had several events occur in Texas that deal with both wind and solar. And then we've seen one or two events in other parts of the country too. So while most of the events are out west, we are also seeing the same effect occurring in other interconnections.
Sure. Appreciate that, Howard. John, did you want to weigh in on this, or are you good?
I mean, I think as far as, the regulatory gaming issue, I think that you brought up, Chris, about, if it's a 50 megawatt threshold, you see units connecting at 49 megawatts. That gets a little bit more difficult under the proposal that NERC has put in place because it's an aggregate of resources at a single interconnection point. And so, any new entrant can trigger, so you could have a bunch of resources that are underneath that. You could have a bunch of half megawatt resources theoretically that are underneath it. But the minute you cross the threshold, all of those resources fall into scope. So it's a little bit more difficult to game that. Again, I would, for folks that are looking, NERC does have a good catalog of events. So if you just Google search under NERC IBR events, it'll take you right to the link, and you can see, events as recently as 2023. There was a battery disturbance in California. That's a really interesting read about how this new technology is creating different issues. I mean, all technologies have issues. These are just different, and they require some different mechanisms to ensure that they don't continue.
For sure. So I want to encourage anyone who's listening in on the call, if you put your questions into the chat, then we have people behind the scenes who, if you've done this before, who will make sure that those get in front of me so that I can ask them of our panelists. And there was a clarification requested by somebody listening that said, did I hear that correctly? Are there only 83 currently identified that need to register within the Western interconnection?
Yeah, that is what's been identified. But again, the more we work through this, and we go out and talk to the TOs, the TOPs, the DPs, we're going to have to work with NERC, as all the regions are, and we're going to have to dig a little deeper to see if we can pick up some more. We're using the EIA, government EIA data, so it's behind a little bit, but well, that's our first start. And as we move forward, we're going to have the discussion with the other functional registrations to understand where they are. I'm going to have a discussion with John to say, well, John, what do you have?
Yeah, so I think, Mark, it's important for people to understand what the registrations you're talking about is an initiative NERC launched last year to ensure that all inverter-based or all IBRs, or actually all resources that should be registered under the current registration mechanisms, are registered. So it's important to differentiate. We're not talking about what Howard is proposing and the registrations that are required under what Howard is proposing, because that's not regulation yet. What you're saying is there's
Absolutely.
a bunch of resources that are out there today that meet the current criteria that are not registered.
Correct, and that's 155. We've also identified 83 that meet the criteria, the future criteria that Howard's talking about, that will need to register. And we see from WEC's few studies that we've looked at, we see a lot more. Yeah. So we're going to have to dig a little deeper and ask folks to give us a help with that.
And I appreciate that clarification, John. So if this is occurring and this change in registration threshold is put in place, John, you talked about trying to be, a big brother to the new little guy who's coming on. And it seems as if you as an investor-owned utility and having a larger footprint, that it would provide some reassurance to you if these entities are also registered and have to comply with some of the same standards that you have to comply with. So are we doing enough to socialize this information? And how do we capture those people that you just talked about that already should be registered under the current threshold but aren't there? Because if we've got 155 more that we're estimating will come on under a new registration threshold, what's that missing puzzle piece in order for us to make sure, what can we do with our investor-owned utilities? Because that's where they're interconnecting.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to unpack there, Chris, but let's talk about the requirements themselves. I mean, we tend to focus on, and I know we've been focusing on some of the technical requirements, such as ensuring that the inverters they behave correctly during events, like they ride through the event correctly, right? So there's some technical standards, but as these resources play a bigger role in reliability of the grid, it's also important that the operators of these resources and the operators of the grid, that we're all speaking the same language. So there are a lot of requirements that are associated with training and how people communicate and how people respond that are as critical as the technical requirements. So as we look at what we need, we really need to ensure that the operators of these reliability assets are all communicating and all operating and all trained at the same level as the current day resources, your more traditional resources. So that's one other aspect I wanted to make sure that we inserted, was that it's beyond, at least I think the conversations that Howard and I have had, is that we envision the applicable requirements being beyond just the technical requirements. And that's important because there are really large aggregators of these resources, entities that control thousands of megawatts of these resources from a single control center. And it is important that, the people that are doing these things are trained and that they know how to operate during an event, both blue and gray and dark skies. I mean, those are all different types of events that have to be managed. As far as our role, I think, you hit it a little. I think, Mark, you hit it a little bit. It requires coordination. It requires coordination at all levels. It requires coordination at the federal level. It requires coordination at the ERO level, and it requires coordination at the state level. And again, we're all going to have to work together to ensure that the grid remains reliable. And for California, and I think there's a few states, California, Texas, Florida, maybe, that are kind of the canaries in the coal mine. We're starting to see the indicators, right? And we can't. I'm not going to pick on the aviation industry, but if we go back to some of the events that have happened with Boeing, there were indicators, right? If you look at that airplane that had the failure, there were several depressurization events that led to the big event. We're seeing similar indicators on the bulk electric system. Look at the events that are happening. The events that are happening are indicators. And as leaders in this industry, and I think everyone on this call, if you're on this call, you play a role in ensuring the reliability of the bulk electric system, the reliability of the grid. We have to ensure that we are listening to what the grid is telling us, because it talks, it tells us when it's not happy. And it's beginning to tell us that, hey, I'm not happy right now. And we need to mine the value of these events and get out in front of this issue before it becomes a bigger issue. And I think this is a good start. I mean, this is a great starting place. Having these conversations, I think, are critical so that we all get on the same page. We get aligned with the direction we need to get to. I'm not saying that it's perfect. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. There's a lot of collaboration that needs to happen between those three people that are those three entities that I discussed: the federal regulators, the ERO, enterprise, and the state. And the ERO, by the way, I know I use terms. The ERO enterprise is the NERC region, so it's NERC and WEC for the people on this call.
Thank you.
One thing I would add to what you had mentioned earlier is, not only are we concerned about operations and communications, but as these aggregators pull more and more of the megawatts together in a concentrated place, we also need good cybersecurity around that too.
Absolutely.
So that's the other area that we'll be looking at too.
Yep. Yeah, the three-legged stool that I think NERC has developed from a regulatory perspective, right? It's the cyber, it's the technical, and it's the training, communications, personnel, requirements that are out there.
Yeah, and to Howard's point about bringing in the cyber aspect of it with regards specifically to the IBRs, I think one of the hardest things right now about trying to get people's attention on something that I think at least all the people on this call believe is a real reliability priority right now is there are so many other things going on in the interconnection, right? We've got the markets conversation and the RA conversation and the transmission conversation. And so I do believe that this IBR conversation needs to be part and parcel for all of those other things, because the reason IBRs are a thing is because of the resource adequacy situation that we're in the West. And resource adequacy can't be adequately addressed without the transmission component that needs to be, exist in place for that. So I agree with the priority of where this should be in the conversation. And so then it's just a matter of making sure that we've got the right people listening in order to be able to get the answers to those questions. Howard, for you talked about this is the who should be registered. And so then we'll get to the what and what standards would apply. Is there a time frame associated with that right now? Is there any speculation on when that piece of the puzzle will begin to be discussed?
Yeah, so good question. Until we know that FERC approves of our registration criteria and that threshold that we've got, we really can't delve into the standards development because it'll all hinge on that. And so, assuming that, early summer, FERC gives us a ruling and says, yes, this is the right criteria, go forth. At that point, we'll have kind of a two-pronged approach. That allows us to release the hounds, so to speak, in the registration area. We're ready. We've started researching. We can begin to do our outreach and begin to register folks. But also the standards folks are ready with their projects to be able to change some of the glossary terms to incorporate the registration criteria. And then also this examination of standards and prioritizing what ones do we do first, what ones are already in the queue that need to maybe have a bit of an adjustment to them. So for instance, there's a project right now to look at ride-through standards for inverter-based resources. And that right now, what at least has been limited to resources that we previously registered, wasn't to this new criteria. We just need to make sure that that standards development process incorporates this new criteria as it goes forward to make sure that it's there too. And similarly, there's probably other projects that are in play right now that would need to take the registration criteria into account.
Okay, that makes sense. There are several questions coming in, and I'm going to read them in real time, so forgive me. I'm trying to make sure that I am responsive to the discussion that's occurring while we've got multiple questions flipping in. So there was a question asked, and this is probably primarily for Mark and John, although Howard may have an opinion as well. Will WEC be working with transmission owners to identify the generation owners and operators where the generators aggregate to 20 MVA and connect at 60 kV and above and notify the appropriate entities?
I can start out. Currently we're working with, all the regions are working together with NERC for the ERO for the second year of this work plan for IBRs. And we need to have that finished up by May 1st. And part of that plan is to start that discussion and outreach with those entities. We're just trying to clear up who begins where and who we talk to. But yes, it will be all those and possibly BAs as well. So, we just don't want to ask double questions or make double work for folks. So we're trying to narrow that down. But yes, we will.
Mark, will there be a more formal process that's put in place as this moves forward to be able to allow those BAs and other utilities to identify and notify WEC of those
Yes, that will be a formal from out of the ERO as a whole for all the regions, NERC and the regions.
Good to know.
Yeah, I think it's, Howard and I and Chris, I think we've had this conversation about this is going to be one of those things that we have to work on as part of this to decide who has that responsibility, right? And it's a difficult one because you don't want to wait till the triggering event happens to then spring it on a bunch of entities. Oh, by the way, now you need a NERC. Now you need to register for NERC compliance. These resources don't get built overnight. I think the interconnection queue is something that we need to look at and possibly leverage so that as we see these facilities crossing a threshold, a year out or 18 months out, that we're giving them that opportunity to get the registration done, become compliant with the requirements by the date that they're in scope. It's the one thing that I really appreciate about the NERC compliance requirements that are a little bit different than others is you have an amazing runway, right? You always have time to get compliant. There is guidance documentation that's provided. There is opportunities to seek assistance from NERC and WEC on getting compliant. So, I think as we look at this and look at the entrants that are coming into play and the diversity of the entrants, right, we're going to have to develop a mechanism that allows us to identify as far out as possible when the 20 megawatt threshold gets crossed, because it's going to be different, right? In some cases, it might be one resource that triggers it, but in looking at our interconnections at SCE at this voltage level, it's probably going to be multiple resources, and it's going to be that, you know, that new 5 megawatt resource that comes into the queue, and that resource then is going to trigger multiple other resources for coming into scope. And when I look at the owners of those resources, very few of them today are part of this compliance program.
If I can just add to that, Chris,
Absolutely.
that's the first part of the 2-year plan, is to start that outreach. You know, as Howard said, the hounds will be let loose, and we're biting at the bit.
Well,
Can't wait.
We have a large population of policymakers who generally dial into this reliability discussion each month. And I'm wondering, is there any advice that you can provide to the policymakers or state regulators that may be on this call, energy offices, legislators, from a policymaking level? Is there anything that they can do to assist in this effort to either get the word out or help educate?
That's I'll speak from my perspective and then let the others chime in. That's a really good question. You know, one of the things that we're actively working on is our relationship with NERC and ensuring that we're working with all of the NERC committees to get the information out and to work as a partner on this. And so, you know, I'll be speaking to the NERC Electricity Committee on April 19th. Just talking about this exact same issue here and helping them understand what we're doing, you know, continent-wide for inverter-based resources. You know, the other thing that I would suggest is to go back to, you know, your areas and start thinking about, you know, if this is an issue that we're seeing percolate up onto transmission system, are there some areas where it might be an issue on distribution? And maybe it's time to get the distribution engineers at each area kind of involved in this to say, let's do an analysis, see whether or not there's issues that are occurring locally that don't bubble up. And it might mean that, you know, when you institute some sort of a generation interconnection within your state, that there might be some IEEE requirements or other requirements, UA or something that would need to be involved in this. And be a requirement for interconnection.
What about you from a utilities perspective? And I appreciate NERC's engagement with NERC from a top-down perspective. I think that that's going to be really important in helping to educate regulators just generally on the principles and kind of what surrounds that IBR industry. From your perspective, John, is there something from utilities who are, of course, asking for recovery of costs and many other things, right? Permissions to behave or take a particular direction. Can we do something to assist you in helping with that dialogue?
You know, I think really the regulatory component is something that really should happen within the regulatory environment. So, you know, jurisdictional boundaries, it's a sensitive area, and as I've stated, you know, to Howard and to NERC leadership, it's really an uncomfortable place for the IOUs to put themselves. You know, really, this is the discussion between the regulators, and then once it's decided about how that regulation will propagate, then it's really, I think, our job to engage with both our state, federal, and the ERO to make sure this is successful. And you know, the IOU community, in partnership with our trade association, the Edison Electric Institute, are very active members in ensuring that the regulation that is developed can be implemented. And that's our job, right? Is to make sure that we can implement what successfully implement. And Howard has heard me say this, although I don't know how often cost effectively implemented. we have those discussions all the time about ensuring that what we see come out of the ERO is risk-based. It's cost effective. We're getting the biggest bang for our ratepayers buck when it comes to what regulation makes the grid more reliable. And so that's again, I think our job is somewhat of a more traditional job compared to, I think, the path forward for the ERO and for FERC and the states, which is really trying to decide how we move the line, so to speak, when it comes to resources now that are in scope for this broader BES type regulation.
I appreciate that. There was a clarification question asked about NERC, and so that is NARUC, and it's the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. And so all of the public regulatory commissions and public utility commissions across the United States belong to this national organization, which Howard mentioned, NARUC. And NERC has been doing a very good job in the last many years coordinating and collaborating with the NARUC community in order to be able to have the correct trickle down of some of this information in order to be able to broaden our scope, I think, on how we educate our stakeholders about many different initiatives that are put forth. So for clarification on that. I also wanted to ask you if all this work is being done with regard to the regulatory threshold, and this may go to Howard more, but I think that John may be in a good position to also opine and see the future a little bit on this one. If threshold is taken care of and that creates standards that these new IBRs will have to adhere to, what issues remain open, if any? Is there any follow-on work that you anticipate will need to be done, or is it really just the implementation of?
Well, that's a loaded question. I think so. Well, this is kind of a cradle to grave scenario here. We start with registering who needs to be done. And then we go into the standards development. Okay, what should they do? And get industry consensus around what they should do. And that will involve, we want to get inverter-based resources involved in that standard development process, just like we do everybody else. So as we go out and register, we'll make sure that they understand who we are as NERC, what our standards development process is, and how they can be actively engaged in it. And then once you know the who and once you know the what, then we go in and start beginning to audit and look at how they perform against the standards. So it's kind of a process like that, and then that provides a feedback. If we begin to see issues, if we begin to see additional risks to reliability or risks that aren't mitigated, then you feed that back into the process to say, okay, what needs to be changed? Is it that we need to develop maybe an additional standard? Maybe a requirement language needs to be changed because it's not clear. It's kind of a continual feedback loop just to make sure that we are adequately addressing those risks to reliability.
I appreciate that, Howard. John, thoughts on that one? You don't have to have any. I just wanted to give you the opportunity.
Yeah, I think I've expressed, there's a lot of things that have to happen in parallel. I would hope that we could do the threshold registration action in parallel, and then pick again, I'll use the term risk, right? Risk rank the requirements that we think apply and try to get the ones that are most critical out in front. I don't want to be critical, but the NERC standards drafting process is somewhat of a juggernaut. I mean, it is. Howard's hair is, and my hair is also thinning. I think both of us have about the same amount of time in role here, and it is a challenge because you try to get consensus on something that is a national standard, and getting consensus on things that are national standards is tough. And so, Chris, I'll put you a little bit on the spot. We might, for the sake of driving this faster, we might even want to look at regional standards. So it might be that out of the gate, we're looking at some things that we're doing in the West a little bit different than national, because I think the regional standards might make more sense, at least initially. And we've seen this, right? Where we've seen the WEC standards that are regional standards that then propagate to other parts of the country through the NERC process. So something we might want to look at if we want to move a little bit faster, we might want to consider the regional approach, at least initially. And, using the registration mechanism that NERC has, and then coupling it with the regional approach might let us be a little bit more nimble on how we get out of the gate here.
I do love the word nimble. I also love that the words of regional approach came out of your mouth and not mine. I saw Mark sort of rubbing his head a little bit there, but I want to be
I'll date myself, Chris, because I was part of some of the initial, the time standard requirements that we had in the West and other things that were very unique to the West. So I'm dating myself, but they
West always
worked,
says we
right?
are different. Yeah,
that's right.
With regard to so many things, that's our mantra. The West is different. I want to be respectful of your time. I know a couple of you have a hard stop at noon, my time, Mountain Time, 4 minutes from now. So I guess the last thing I would ask is just a general question of, do we feel like we have our arms around the IBR opportunity, let's call it, not issue, right? Do we feel like this gets our arms around it, or is there still a lot that we don't know, which I know is sort of a trick question, but I'm curious, from a reliability perspective, do we feel like we're getting our arms around what the new opportunities are with IBRs on the system?
Yeah, I'll start with that. I think based on what we've seen in past events and what we've seen, in reactions, I think we're headed in the right direction. But we're going to continually be monitoring this to determine whether or not, whether or not we're charting the right course or not. But at least from all the information we have at this point, we really firmly believe this is the right direction to be headed.
For sure. John?
Oh, yeah, I would agree with Howard, and I'm going to use the word, we need to be extremely agile as we go forward, because I think it could change very quickly. So
last word to John.
Yeah, so I think there are different size regulatory hammers that can be used to drive things forward. I can green frame that and say different regulatory tools, but in this case here, I think, we're approaching it the right way. I would ask people to be collaborative as we go through the process, understand that, like I said earlier, the grid is talking to us and it's telling us that it needs some help. And, the folks that are on this call, coupled with, the participants on this call, we are charged with that. And so I think it's important that we listen to what the grid's telling us. We act with, I think, the right level of urgency on this issue. And I think NERC is framing it correctly. I think the fact that we're talking about it today is a really good thing. Be active participants, look at the material NERC is putting out, look at the material FERC is putting out on this. Be well informed on this issue because it's one that needs to move quickly.
Thank you, all three of you. I really appreciate your contribution to this conversation. I feel like you were just the right people to have this initial discussion, and we look forward to ongoing conversations about it. I hope that this spurs additional conversations with the broader group of stakeholders, and to the extent that WEC and NERC can help you, John, in that space to make sure that everybody's understanding correctly what it is we're doing and where it is that we're headed and why, then we definitely want to be resources for you in order to be able to do that. So I'm grateful for your time and your knowledge, and I will pass it back to Travis to close us out. Thanks so much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Great, Chris. Thank you so much for moderating there, and to Howard, Mark, and John. Appreciate you for joining and sharing that gratitude. Appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules. I do want to share that on May 1st, we'll be having the discussion series will continue. We're going to be taking a look at the summer outlook for 2024 here in the West, and we'll be discussing a preview of summer weather, forecasting, planning, and taking a look at resources. So that will, again, be Wednesday, May 1st at 11 a.m. Looking forward to that. And then in the chat real quickly, I'm going to provide those resources that we had talked about earlier. So those reference guides and resources that everyone had discussed earlier are now in the chat for you as well. So again, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks again, guys.